France, January 26, 1945. The winter air was knife-cold, cutting through the shattered woods of Holzwihr. Smoke drifted low over the snow, where the bodies of men and machines lay frozen in silence. Then a sound shattered it, the deep, rhythmic roar of a 50-caliber machine gun. At the edge of a burning tank destroyer, a lone American stood his ground. Flames licked around the metal hull beneath his boots, yet he didn't move. His name was Audie Murphy, barely 20 years old, a boy from a Texas farm now fighting the German army alone. Enemy soldiers advanced through the haze. Dozens, then hundreds, their rifles flashing in the blinding white of winter. Each burst from Murphy's gun tore through the mist, each round a defiance against death itself. His face was calm, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. The radio behind him crackled with desperate calls to retreat. But he stayed. Alone on the burning wreck, he poured fire into the advancing line until the barrels glowed red. When the gun finally fell silent, the field below him was littered with German bodies, and that was the moment a farm boy from Texas became Germany's worst nightmare. In 1942, the world stood at its darkest hour. Europe was a fortress under the iron rule of Nazi Germany. From the French coast to the Russian steppes, Adolf Hitler's armies held dominion over a continent crushed by fear and fire. Cities burned. Nations vanished. Resistance movements operated in whispers and shadows. Across the Atlantic, the United States, once distant from Europe's turmoil, had been thrust into global war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Within months, American factories thundered to life, producing tanks, rifles, and bombers at a scale history had never seen. Millions of young men were called to arms. They came from farms, cities, and small towns, carrying little more than courage and conviction. By 1943, Allied forces were bleeding their way back into Europe, inch by inch. The North African campaign had ended in victory, but the cost was staggering. Next came the invasion of Sicily and Italy, where soldiers fought not just the enemy, but the mountains, mud, and misery of endless war. Every battle brought lessons about leadership, terrain, and survival. The U.S. Army was transforming from a fledgling force into a hardened machine. Yet, amid the grand strategies and famous generals, the war's true shape was defined by the ordinary men who carried rifles into hell. In the frozen forests of France or the dusty valleys of Italy, the battle always came down to one thing: endurance. Those who could stand when others broke became legends. Among them was a young man no one expected to be there at all. A thin, quiet boy from a Texas farm, with eyes too soft for war. His name barely registered in the rosters of the U.S. Army. But within 2 years, that name, Audie Murphy, would echo through every Allied division as a symbol of defiance and survival. What turned a farmhand into a warrior? What forged courage out of poverty and fear? The answers began long before the sound of gunfire, in the dust and hunger of rural America. Audie Leon Murphy was born on June 20th, 1925, in Kingston, Texas, into a world defined by hardship. The Great Depression had stripped the land of its promise. The Murphys were sharecroppers, poor, overworked, and constantly moving in search of survival. Audie was the 7th of 12 children, a boy who learned early that life demanded more than it gave. His father drifted from job to job before leaving altogether. His mother, Josie, was the center of what little stability remained. Gentle, devout, and endlessly exhausted. By the time Audie was a teenager, he had become the family's provider, hunting rabbits with a borrowed rifle to feed his siblings. Hunger was his first enemy. Responsibility, his first command. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, the news reached even the quiet farms of Texas. For Audie, war wasn't an abstract idea. It was a way out, a test of worth, a chance to change his fate. At 16, he tried to enlist in the Marines and then the Navy, but both turned him away for being underage and underweight. So he lied about his age, joined the U.S. Army in 1942, and began a journey that would transform him from a boy into a soldier forged in fire. Training was brutal. The Army toughened him, physically, mentally, and morally. His small frame masked a quiet endurance that few could match. In camp, other recruits saw a shy, soft-spoken Texan. But his instructors noticed something else: unbreakable focus, a natural eye for marksmanship, and the kind of calm that only comes from surviving hardship. In 1943, he was sent overseas with the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, one of the hardest fighting units of the war. His baptism by fire came in Sicily, under the relentless sun and chaos of mountain warfare. There, he learned the cruel arithmetic of combat. One wrong step could mean death. From Sicily to Salerno and up the boot of Italy, Murphy rose through the ranks. His courage was steady, his instincts deadly. Fellow soldiers said he moved like he belonged on the battlefield, as if the fear that crippled others had already burned out of him long ago. By the time his division landed in southern France during Operation Dragoon in 1944, the quiet farm boy from Texas had become something else entirely. A soldier shaped by hunger, loss, and the endless test of survival. And soon, the transformation would be complete when fate placed him before an advancing German army, utterly alone. War is often remembered in medals and numbers, but for Audie Murphy, it was measured in sleepless nights, shaking hands, and the faces of men he couldn't save. Beneath the legends and headlines was a young man who carried exhaustion like a second skin. The human angle of Murphy's story isn't found in his victories. It's in his fear. He admitted later that he was terrified every time he went into battle. But he also said that fear kept him alive. When shells burst overhead and bullets snapped through the air, he didn't freeze. He adapted. Survival became instinct. His world narrowed to a single purpose: to protect the men beside him. That focus is what separated him from most. In war, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the mastery of it. And Murphy mastered it with unnerving calm. He learned to read the ground like a map of death and opportunity, knowing where to take cover, when to move, and when to strike. This leads to the tactical angle, the one trick that would make him Germany's nightmare. Murphy had a gift few possessed: the ability to think clearly under fire. In the chaos of combat, when radios failed and commanders fell, he improvised. He turned ordinary terrain into advantage, using hedgerows, ditches, and ruins as extensions of his weapon. He studied enemy behavior, predicting patterns, the way German squads advanced, the rhythm of their mortars, the timing between attacks. That awareness turned battles into chess games. He didn't rely on luck. He relied on calculation. Murphy wasn't a strategist in a tent. He was a tactician in the mud. He led small groups of men with precision, using minimal firepower to maximum effect. He favored ambushes, deception, and the element of surprise. Once, during a firefight in Italy, he single-handedly took out a German machine gun nest by crawling through mud and tossing grenades with uncanny accuracy. He was never reckless, only deliberate. His decisions, made in seconds, saved lives again and again. By late 1944, his superiors knew he was more than just brave. He was efficient, a soldier who could take command when chaos ruled. And soon, in the forests of France, those instincts would face their ultimate test. By 1944, Audie Murphy had seen more death than most men could bear in a lifetime. He had fought in Sicily, Italy, and southern France, each battle taking something from him. The psychological angle of his story reveals not a fearless hero, but a man hollowed out by the constant presence of death. He was promoted to lieutenant, not because he sought command, but because others kept dying. His leadership was born from necessity. He led with the quiet authority of someone who had no illusions left. His men trusted him because he never asked them to do what he wouldn't do himself. In the midst of artillery fire and chaos, Murphy stayed calm. Not out of confidence, but because panic was a luxury he could no longer afford. The trauma seeped in slowly. Friends lost in ambushes, men torn apart by mortars, the sound of screams echoing through the night. Each victory left a wound that no medal could heal. Soldiers around him described moments when Murphy seemed distant, detached, as if part of him remained on every battlefield he left behind. Yet, within that psychological toll lay the reason he became a legend. He never gave in to despair. He turned pain into purpose. He fought because stopping meant remembering. This is where the symbolic angle emerges. To the American public, Audie Murphy became the face of courage, the embodiment of what the United States wanted to believe about itself. A poor farm boy who rose from nothing, fought for everything, and refused to break. In a war defined by industrial might, he reminded the world that human spirit still mattered. When newspapers later told of his single-handed stand against German forces, Murphy became more than a man. He became an idea, the idea that one determined individual could alter the course of history. But in truth, Murphy never saw himself that way. He saw himself as a soldier who did what had to be done. No glory, no myth, just survival. And it was that humility, that refusal to be larger than the men beside him, that made him immortal in their eyes. The farm boy had become a symbol, not of triumph, but of endurance. The quiet strength that carried a generation through the darkest war in human history. Now, with Europe frozen under the last gasp of the Third Reich, Murphy's destiny was about to meet its fiercest test. At a small, snow-covered village called Holzwihr. It was the winter of 1945, and the war in Europe was nearing its end. But the Germans were far from finished. After the failed Ardennes offensive, Hitler's armies were retreating, yet they fought with the desperation of a dying beast. The Colmar Pocket in eastern France became one of the last strongholds of German resistance west of the Rhine. On January 26, near the small French village of Holzwihr, the men of Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, were dug in along a wooded ridge. Their task was to hold against a larger German counterattack. Snow covered the ground, freezing the blood of every man who crouched behind his rifle. Visibility was low, the cold unrelenting. Audie Murphy, now a second lieutenant, was in command of what remained of his company. Once a force of 120 men, only about 40 were still standing. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and faced an enemy preparing to strike with tanks, artillery, and infantry. Murphy had been through countless battles before, but this was different. The terrain was open, the defensive position exposed, and the Germans were approaching in strength. He quickly positioned his men along a tree line, ordering them to prepare fallback points. Nearby, 2 M10 tank destroyers were stationed to support the defense. One of them parked slightly forward on the road. Then, the bombardment began. German shells screamed through the trees, tearing branches apart, showering snow and metal over the American line. Murphy's radio crackled with reports. Tanks advancing from the east, infantry spreading through the forest. He didn't panic. Moving through the chaos, he coordinated his men, calling for artillery strikes, adjusting positions, shouting orders through the thunder of explosions. He knew they couldn't hold indefinitely, but every minute they delayed the German advance would save American lives behind them. The first wave hit hard. German Panzer IVs rolled forward, supported by machine gun fire and squads of infantry. The M10 tank destroyers fired in response. One managed to knock out a tank before being struck and set ablaze. The other was disabled by artillery fire, its crew scrambling for cover. The Americans were outnumbered 5-1. Murphy ordered his men to fall back to a secondary line behind the tree line, while he stayed forward to direct fire. His calm was absolute. His mind focused only on coordination and survival. But as he peered through the smoke and snow, watching German troops advance toward the burning M10, Murphy made a decision that would defy logic, fear, and death itself. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning fuel. Flames licked across the metal carcass of the M10 tank destroyer as German soldiers advanced through the haze, shouting, firing, closing in. The rest of Company B had withdrawn to safer ground, but one man stayed behind. Audie Murphy climbed onto the crippled M10, its steel plating searing hot beneath his boots. He could feel the heat through his uniform, but he ignored it. Atop the wreck sat a .50 caliber Browning machine gun, still intact. Murphy swung the heavy weapon toward the approaching line and opened fire. The sound was deafening, the gun's thunder cutting through the winter silence like judgment. Tracers ripped across the snow, cutting down German infantry as they emerged from the tree line. They tried to flank him, but every attempt was met with a storm of bullets. He was a single figure against an army, a man consumed by the rhythm of survival. When ammunition belts ran low, he replaced them himself, crouching into the flames for cover. Shells exploded nearby, showering him with earth and ice, yet he refused to move. The radio beside him crackled with a frantic voice. "Pull back! You're too exposed!" Murphy pressed the transmitter to his ear and replied calmly, "Hold your position. I'm covering you." Then he fired again. For nearly an hour, he held his ground alone. When a German tank turned its gun toward him, Murphy called in artillery strikes from his exposed position, adjusting the coordinates as rounds landed perilously close. The tank was hit and burned. German troops broke, retreating under the weight of relentless fire. When his final belt of ammunition ran dry, Murphy climbed down, dazed, covered in soot and blood, and rallied what remained of his men for a counterattack. Together, they drove the Germans out of Holzwihr. When it was over, the field was silent again. More than 50 German soldiers lay dead, and an entire enemy company had been repelled by one man's stand. His boots were charred, his uniform shredded, his hands trembling from exhaustion. Yet, when asked later why he hadn't retreated, his answer was simple. "They were killing my friends." That single hour on the burning M10 would etch Audie Murphy's name into military history. The moment when a farm boy from Texas became the most decorated American soldier of the Second World War. When the smoke cleared over Holzwihr, the battlefield lay silent, littered with broken weapons, frozen bodies, and the blackened skeleton of the M10 tank destroyer, where Audie Murphy had made his stand. His company, thought lost, emerged from the woods to find their commander still standing, dazed, half-deaf from the roar of his own gun, and barely able to speak. The scene defied belief. A single man had held off an entire German assault, allowing his men to regroup and survive. In the official report, his actions were described as incredible gallantry and intrepidity. But those words couldn't capture what the soldiers who witnessed it saw: a boy who refused to die. Murphy himself downplayed the event. When questioned by his superiors, he gave short, matter-of-fact answers. "I just got mad," he said. "They were killing my friends." To him, it wasn't heroism, it was duty. Yet, for the men who survived because of him, it was something far greater. In the weeks that followed, the Army investigated the details of the battle. Witness statements were unanimous. His actions had stopped the German advance and saved dozens of American lives. For that, on June 2, 1945, Audie Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. By the end of the war, His uniform carried 33 medals and citations from the United States and Allied nations, more than any other American soldier of World War II. Among them were the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 2 Bronze Stars, but behind the medals lay exhaustion. When reporters asked how it felt to be America's most decorated soldier, he answered quietly, "I'd give them all back if I could bring my friends home." That was the truth few wanted to hear. To the world, Audie Murphy had become a symbol of courage. To himself, he was a survivor, haunted by the memories of faces he could never forget, and battles that never truly ended. The war had made him a hero, but it had also taken away the part of him that once belonged to peace. When Audie Murphy returned home in 1945, America greeted him as a legend. Newspapers called him the bravest soldier in history. He appeared on magazine covers, his quiet face now a symbol of victory. But behind the headlines, Murphy was restless. The war had ended, but the battlefield still echoed inside his mind. He was just 20 years old, too young for the fame that found him. The parades, interviews, and photographs felt hollow. The medals that shone on his chest only reminded him of those who would never return. In private, he battled insomnia, nightmares, and sudden bursts of panic. In an age before post-traumatic stress disorder had a name, he carried his wounds in silence. Murphy found an unexpected path in Hollywood. With encouragement from actor James Cagney, he began appearing in war films. The camera seemed to understand him. It captured the quiet intensity that others couldn't describe. In 1955, he starred as himself in To Hell and Back, the film adaptation of his own wartime memoir. It became one of the most successful war movies of its era. Audiences saw a hero, but those close to him saw a man still at war with himself. He slept with a pistol under his pillow. Loud noises made him dive for cover. He used his fame not for glory, but to speak up for veterans who, like him, returned from battle only to fight invisible wars of the mind. He never let the hero worship define him. "I'm no hero," he often said. "I just did what had to be done." Murphy continued acting through the 1950s and 1960s, though his struggles with depression and survivor's guilt never faded. He lost money in failed ventures, faced personal turmoil, and sought solitude in the countryside. Yet he remained fiercely loyal to the men who had served beside him, visiting hospitals and writing letters to widows of fallen soldiers. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy was killed in a plane crash in Virginia. He was 45 years old. His grave at Arlington National Cemetery became one of the most visited in America, second only to President John F. Kennedy's. Even in death, he stood as the quiet reminder that true heroism isn't found in glory, but in endurance. In the end, Audie Murphy's story isn't just about medals, battles, or fame. It's about what war does to the human soul. He began as a poor farm boy from Texas, barefoot in the dust, chasing dreams too small for the world he was about to enter. Yet, when the world called, he answered, not out of glory, but out of duty. Murphy's courage was not the fearless kind sung in ballads. It was the desperate courage of a young man who refused to surrender when everything around him fell apart. The fire that nearly consumed him on the battlefield would burn quietly inside him for the rest of his life. A reminder that heroes are often those who carry their scars unseen. In Murphy, we see both the horror and the honor of the Second World War, the brutality that tested humanity, and the resilience that defined it. His journey from the fields of Texas to the flames of Europe, and finally, to the silver screen mirrors, the story of a generation that endured unimaginable hardship and emerged forever. Changed, he showed that true bravery is not about standing tall without fear, but about standing anyway. even when fear is all that remains. Audie Murphy was many things: a soldier, an actor, a symbol. But above all, he was human. And that perhaps is the greatest courage of all.